It's great to have everybody here today. I'm so thankful that you're spending your lunchtime period learning more about this important topic. And Governors for Schools and our guest speakers who are here with us today would like to say thank you for taking the time to attend. Now, today we're going to be focusing on disadvantaged pupils, and in particular, what schools and their governors can do to support students' achievement in this area. Educational performance of pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds unfortunately remains lower than their peers from non-disadvantaged backgrounds. And naturally, this is a concern for school leadership teams, as it is for governors for schools. Despite some progress over the past decade, England actually retains a relatively large attainment gap among countries in the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, which some of you may know is the OECD. Increases in the number of children who are living in persistent poverty has actually been cited as a reason for slowing progress in this attainment gap. And it's not just pupils' attainment and core subjects that this impacts. Research has shown that pupils experiencing poverty in England are financially excluded from full participation in a wide range of school subjects and activities, such as PE, music, swimming, art and design. And at Governors for Schools, we want this to change. Furthermore, numerous studies have shown that actually the impact of the pandemic is having an even more pronounced impact on students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And in some cases, the achievement that we've made in reducing the attainment gap is now starting to go the other way. It's with this concerning data in mind that we've decided to organise today's webinar. We want to help governors understand what they can do to ensure that attainment is at the heart of decision making, strategic planning and accountability for disadvantaged pupils. We're very pleased to be welcomed by Sam Henson, Director of Policy and Communications at the National Governors Association, to look at effective use of Pupil Premium in increasing attainment for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And in addition, I'm also delighted to welcome Kate Ainsley, who's a project lead for the Cost of the School Day project at the Child Poverty Action Group, who will be exploring what school leaders can do to mitigate the effects that disadvantage and poverty can have on pupils' inclusion and achievement in the school life. Now, before we get stuck in and we get to talk about these really important issues, there are a few pieces of housekeeping that I would like to mention. Today's webinar is going to be recorded and it can be shared with your board after the webinar. Following the webinar today, you'll get an email with a link to today's recording, as well as slides that our presenters are using, and you're warmly welcome to share those with your board. In terms of questions, we welcome questions. It's a really great part of webinars that we have the opportunity to speak to Sam and Kate about these topics. And if you have any questions that you would like either of them to answer, please pop them into the Q&A feature. Governors for Schools members of staff will be keeping an eye on the Q&A throughout the presentation, and at the end of the presentation we will have time for questions. So please don't worry about getting your questions answered. We will have time for that later. Now, I'm very pleased to be joined by Sam and Kate today, and without further ado, I would like to introduce Sam a little more formally. Sam Henson is Director of Policy and Communications at the National Governors Association. And in addition to overseeing NGA's policy, information and research services, Sam also supports the Chief Executive in leading the organisation to achieve positive change in policy of school governance. So Sam, I'd like to hand over to you and thank you very much for your time.
Brill, thanks so much, Ashley. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen and get my slides up for everyone. Hopefully you can all see that. Has that come up okay?
Yep.
Brill, excellent. Well, really great to be here today, and a real privilege to spend this time with you all. And this is a topic which I know will be so important to so many of us, and it really is a topic that's really important to me. So both from in my role at NGA, but I'm also a trustee of a multi-academy trust, but also more widely, I think this is a topic that really deserves more attention. So absolutely brilliant that the Governors for Schools are holding this webinar. So I'm just going to kind of get started just by providing a bit of an overview really on the Pupil Premium itself for anyone who's perhaps new to looking at this as an area, or new to governing, or if maybe you've been governing for quite some time. I think it's quite helpful to have a bit of a reminder of where we're at. And I think as Ashley said in the introduction, the gap between the educational outcomes of disadvantaged students and the rest of the student population is one of the greatest challenges facing our education system. And that pre-pandemic research that's been mentioned, and I know the Education Policy Institute, their research highlighted that the attainment gap between poor children and other students was a full 18 months behind by the end of Key Stage 4, and progress made in closing that seemed to be stalling in 2018 and 19. So this is clearly a topic that boards, governing boards, need to be engaging in now as much as ever before. And we've got that wide range of evidence and research which highlighted the detrimental impact of COVID on disadvantage as well. So we need to be bearing that in mind as we're looking at all of this. If we kind of go back in time for a moment, the introduction of the Pupil Premium in April 2011, in theory, it established a new funding stream aimed at improving the attainment of disadvantaged pupils. And the rates currently stand at £1,345 per pupil for primary pupils, recorded as ever 6 free school meals, and £995 for secondary. We've got a slight increase on that for next year. And that ever 6 free school meals, that simply means pupils recorded on the school census who were recorded as known to be eligible for free school meals in any of the termly censuses in the previous 6 years. And with this funding came really a new accountability requirement for governing boards, and that is, something that I think we need to come back to, and I'm going to be exploring in some depth with you today. The actual extent to which governing boards are involved in these decisions, they're involved in these discussions, how they perceive funding for their disadvantaged pupils, and the impact of boards' involvement is hugely mixed. And governing boards are a part of the process in evaluating and sustaining the Pupil Premium strategy. So it's a really, really important role. And in evaluating the strategy, that means being committed to that cycle of review and evaluation. And in sustaining it, it's about ensuring that implementation isn't suffering, and that there's CPD, there's resources in place to keep it going. So that's kind of the backdrop for what I want to be talking about today. So I wanted to come back to this question about who is accountable and for what. And being accountable for pupil premium spending is more than a compliance activity. It's an opportunity for leadership and governance to demonstrate that co-created ambition, which I think is really important. We want to come at this from the point of view that boards are the ones that can drive that ambition for your disadvantaged pupils. And accountability, I think, is too often thought of in that lingering presence of accountability around that's driven by Ofsted or the department and so on. We want to go beyond that, and we want to be thinking about accountability is about providing answers to the people that matter, the school community, and the board has that key role in driving that forwards. So for the use of Pupil Premium, there's a need to be answerable to the funder, the public, not just Whitehall, but also to the school's communities, and crucially to be accountable to the individuals it's there for as well. And governing boards, not Ofsted, provide that first and most important line of accountability. I stole that line from our CEO Emma Knight's annual address. I just thought it was a really good line. I keep using it at the moment, but it really kind of gets stuck in your head, and it's really good to come back to that. I think governing boards, through their accountability, are there to ensure that the school meets the department's requirement set out for Pupil Premium, but also to go beyond that. Boards are charged with their 3 core functions: one, to hold leaders to account; another is making sure money is well spent, and combined, these are key to maximizing the use of the Pupil Premium. And this hugely important responsibility really has to be kept under review through the governing board cycle. And if your governing board isn't talking about Pupil Premium very much, then for me, I think that's the first place to start. That's the first real issue. So that wider accountability focus has really been growing. It's now a funding requirement to use the DFE's template, which is designed to ensure compliance with the conditions of the grant and so on. But like I said, I want to move beyond simple compliance for the sake of this conversation today. NGA was really pleased to see the work of the Department for Education on Pupil Premium strategies, encouraging schools to think across 3 years. I think that's a really good step forwards, and that's something that NGA does too. You know, we recommend that boards think about their vision setting and their strategy for helping them to achieve that vision. And then this links us back to that core function number 1, ensuring clarity of vision, ethos, and strategic direction. And getting the Pupil Premium use right cannot be done without being inextricably linked to the vision, which gives rise to the overall focus of strategic planning. So I think, you know, that this is really key to the wider role of governing boards. So this next slide, I wanted to bring us back then to that core function number 1, but then also think more widely about where Pupil Premium and where disadvantage sits within the culture of your organization. Boards should think about Pupil Premium in the terms of the culture of their organization, and what you value in your ethos. And the DFE's definition of disadvantage refers to eligibility for Pupil Premium. However, the organization's leadership and governance should be first, I believe, spending significant time really getting to grips with what disadvantage means for you, considering what that actual definition of disadvantage is in the context of your school or your trust. And there may be a focus on pupils who've had little access to technology, those who've had experienced loss, pupils from certain backgrounds. But Pupil Premium is a vehicle, really. It's a vehicle for ensuring that those pupils who begin life with more disadvantages than others end up with the same opportunities as their peers. And the DFE states that it's actually school leaders and boards who are best placed to decide how it should make those spending decisions, how it should work, and how it's applied. So broadening this topic, I think, is really important by looking at the wider definition of disadvantage and considering the wider society issues and making actual some space on your governing boards to discuss that. I think is really important. I think it's also worth saying at this point as well, before the pandemic, there was concern that more children were suffering under an increased weight of poverty. And now here we are, having endured this huge disruption to life. And I'm sure Kate will talk to us more about that a bit later on. This slide it is all about matching responses to barriers. So 3 years ago, NGA carried out some research on the Pupil Premium, a study called Spotlight on Disadvantage. And in that research, we looked at the role of governing boards in spending, monitoring, and evaluating the impact of Pupil Premium. And that considered Pupil Premium plans and the way governing boards were signing off their expenditure and how involved they were. We looked at the common barriers to learning and the popular initiatives that we use to support Pupil Premium students as well. We used a survey and analysis of Pupil Premium strategies to arrive at that point. And what we found through that work was really a mismatch between barriers to engagement caused by family life, low attendance, social and emotional barriers, and those things around individual needs and circumstances, and then the solutions, which were largely centered on teaching and learning. And this is something we've raised time and time again since, and it's interesting. I think that both the department, the EEF and others recommend now this tiered approach, and not just focusing purely on one level. So we're keen that leaders and governing boards do not ignore those things which are difficult to measure, such as those on culture, pastoral and practical things. Improving teaching clearly is always going to be right at the very heart of school improvement, but only focusing on that tends to actually widen the gap as the progress of the most advantaged pupils increases too, often at a greater rate than disadvantaged pupils. So we need to be thinking and coming back to that tiered approach at board level. This next slide, I just wanted to kind of bring our attention to the strategic operational divide. It's not really just about having disadvantage as an agenda item. It's more looking at every strategic decision made through the lens of disadvantage, and addressing the gap created by COVID. Clearly daunting, but actually it creates a unique opportunity to change our approach and to ramp up the strategic conversation in a new way, which I think is really important. There's an opportunity to ensure that we don't go backwards, but we're taking a new strategic discussion forwards with renewed vigor. That long-term challenge requires a long-term strategy, building it into vision. You know, it's not a short-term fix. The school's leadership team, they're clearly, as you can see here, as this picture shows, are involved with writing and implementing the plan, but the board has this key role in approving the plan, in monitoring and providing that question and challenge around it and how it's working. So I think that what this does, it brings to life that co-creation, that working together, that this is an exercise where the board and the leadership team really need to come together and have that joint ownership as well. So this next slide just really kind of builds on that previous one, just demonstrating that this is all part of that cycle, the role of leadership and governance and coming together. It shows the cycle where the governing board fits in, where leadership steps in, where they come together, where they work together. Leadership and governance coming together to understand each other's roles in this process, I think is really important as well. I think it's worth saying at this point, one of the issues we've seen in the past is where boards are even not involved in the strategy around Pupil Premium at all, and they're completely at arm's length, and so there's a lack of ownership. There is no real conversation at board level. But then the other extreme is when the board gets involved in the operational and treads on toes and in a quite an unhelpful way. So we need to come back to arriving at some clear lines in terms of where roles stop and where they begin. I think that's really key in getting the approach right. Okay, so this next slide I've got is all about making good decisions and demonstrating the evidence, and it just shows you the information that boards value when they're making those decisions. And the evidence clearly has to be rooted in reality and the context of today, but be meaningful. And our spotlight on disadvantage work showed that leaders and governing boards can be quite inward looking sometimes when it comes to this, favouring the judgments of staff and internal sources of data when deciding how to spend. On implementation, for example, the most commonly used example is teaching assistants, which can be brilliant if you get it right with the right staff, training, delegation, and so on. But it can also be detrimental to pupils. Sometimes if all that's happening is they're simply spending big chunks of their day with staff less qualified than their usual teacher. So actually getting a measured approach to this, I think, is really, really important. using the likes of the EEF to understand the new education context and using the tools provided that are out there, I think is really key. Accountability for Pupil Premium, as we've said, you know, it rests with the board, but it's dependent on leaders presenting the right information to the board. So if you're not sure if you're getting the right information, you know, if you're not being provided at board level with reports on clear variations in progress and attainment between pupils eligible for the Pupil Premium and other pupils, if you're not getting information which is showing you the trends and barriers to learning and the strategies that target underachievement, then actually that's one thing to challenge and to go back and ask, well, where is this information? We need to see this. So I think that's just quite a helpful chart to look at in terms of the different sources used there. And then this slide here, a similar slide, but what this shows you is the data that governing boards value when they're monitoring the impact of Pupil Premium. And just on monitoring the impact, I think it's worth saying that parental engagement will become more important than ever, I think, both in terms of understanding the impact on community and the impact on individuals, and getting that local intelligence, particularly as we kind of move into this post COVID era. While there's no set monitoring process, the board does need to receive regular reports from leaders once a term, covering current context, that, you know, things like the number of eligible pupils, previous performance, spending to date, and an assessment of that spending against intended impact. That information is, again, really important if you're really going to be involved in that monitoring role. We should quickly talk about the appointment of link governors and trustees. Can be a really useful way for boards to monitor these areas while making use of an individual's experience and skill set. That particular role, that champion needs to question the Pupil Premium policies and be involved and go and do visits and really have that interest and engagement in this as an area at another level. But linking a governor or a trustee to Pupil Premium, it doesn't remove the board's collective responsibility. Rather, it should complement that monitoring process. So I think that's a really key thing to be aware of. I know that some boards in the past have made that kind of mistake where actually we've got a Pupil Premium link governor and that's it. We don't need to have wider conversations at board level, but you absolutely do need to. And so for my final slide, I'm aware it's got like 1 or 2 minutes left, it is around Ofsted, accountability in Ofsted. And Ofsted inspectors will only use your statement to help them prepare for their visits. They don't require any specific document or plan other than your Pupil Premium strategy. But what they will really be interested in is evaluating the evidence, the impact of the curriculum as a whole, including on the most disadvantaged pupils, so pupils who meet that criteria for Pupil Premium. So really thinking ahead on that. And inspectors will want to see that rationale and that intended impact behind that governance role and your funding decisions that have happened around Pupil Premium. In theory, Ofsted inspectors will consider the board's oversight of Pupil Premium when assessing how well it fulfills its responsibility to overseeing the financial performance of the school. But by and large, what we tend to find is most of it comes back down to these conversations around curriculum, certainly with the new framework that has been in place now for a couple of years. So primarily the question aimed at boards from inspectors are around curriculum, but Ofsted's is clearly a big deal for all of us. But in terms of accountability, going right back to my earlier point, it's definitely not the biggest deal. You know, we want expert views from outside, you know, as part of that triangulation process, absolutely, but they are not the primary form of accountability. You are the governing boards, and boards are expected to show that awareness of importance on this spending. The final thing I'll say is that I think to get this right, at NGA we urge boards to avoid the assumption that all such pupils, so those pupils who are eligible for pupil premium, are low achieving. You know, if a disadvantaged child is achieving well, then the funding is there to help them achieve even more highly. And Ofsted will check that schools are not underestimating or stereotyping disadvantaged students. And I think that's a really key point, really, for me to end on. You know, low expectations of the pupil premium cohort, you know, can really come to the detriment of you as a board. So actually, don't go there is what I would urge you, and actually keep those ambitions high, keep that culture there going with that high ambition for all of your pupils. And I'm aware I've probably gone on a minute or two longer than I should have, so I'll stop there, Ashley.
Thank you very much, Sam. I really appreciated the information that you've given me. And for me, what I found particularly useful was the slide around the relationship between senior leaders and governors, which kind of showcased the differentiation of roles and where the roles overlapped. And I think as a governor myself, sometimes it can be difficult to know where your role starts and where it ends when it's something as important as this. So I found that slide particularly useful, and I'm sure others will as well.
Right.
Now that we've had that really great overview of Pupil Premium and some of the things that we think about, I think it would be a good idea now to look at disadvantage in a little bit more depth. And this is where I'd like to bring in Kate Ainsley. Kate is the project lead for the Cost of the School Day project with the Child Poverty Action Group. Kate works across the whole of the UK to understand the best ways that school life can be better for young people, so that we can ensure that a lack of financial means will not result in young people missing out. She's been with the Child Poverty Action Group since November 2018, so has seen the situation of the pandemic unfold firsthand whilst working at the organisation. Kate, I'm very pleased to hand over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Ashley, and thanks, Sam. Again, just really pleased to be here and to be talking about this subject, and hopefully what I'm going to share can sort of contribute to thinking on this issue. I have noticed a few questions in the chat already, and I might be able to kind of pick up on some of those as I go along. So yeah, as Ashley has already introduced me, I'm Kate Ainsley from the Child Poverty Action Group. As a charity, we work on behalf of children across the UK growing up in poverty. And my job in particular is to look at education and sort of where those barriers to education might lie for children living on a low income. So before I kind of go into the project and some of the sort of research that we've done, I think it's really important to just understand the scale of the issue that we're talking about. So the scale of child poverty in the UK at the moment. At the moment, the kind of current data that we have is all from pre-pandemic. So we don't have the sort of stats from the last year. But looking at that pre-pandemic data, we're talking about 31% of children across the UK who are growing up in poverty. And that equates to about 4.3 million children. I personally find those numbers kind of quite hard to get my head around, but when we're talking about it in a sort of classroom sense, that is on average 9 children in a classroom of 30 growing up in poverty. And here I've used a sort of Wordle graphic to help illustrate that point. And I guess what I also want to say is 9 in 30 is an average. We know there's lots and lots of classrooms out there where it will be a lot higher than that. In terms of the kind of picture across the UK, as the sort of data shows at the moment, Wales has currently has the highest child poverty levels at 31%, very closely followed by England, and then Scotland and Northern Ireland are slightly lower than that. But I guess one thing that I'll pick up on here is this idea that actually the numbers around child poverty don't necessarily, or certainly don't correlate with those who are eligible for free school meals and pupil premium. So we'll come back to that point. What do we mean by child poverty? Just very briefly, there's the kind of technical meaning of child poverty and the things that we base the data and the stats on and the UK government use. And for that, we're talking about families that live in households that earn or have an income of 60% less than the median income in a society. So that's where our poverty line sits, and obviously that changes depending on what the median income in a society is. Hence this idea of it sort of being relative to the society, but that's the kind of household that we're talking about, and we're talking about children growing up in poverty. At Child Poverty Action Group, we also use a kind of more human description of child poverty, and I think you kind of need to use both of these to really understand the full picture. So Peter Townsend has a definition that talks more about families and children being able to sort of obtain the right types of diet, participate in activities, have the same living conditions that other people would expect, and that is widely kind of agreed in society as being the sort of the norm. So I think, as I say, just thinking about both of those things, both kind of the financial implications of poverty, but also what that might feel like in terms of children's experiences. Any family can fall into poverty, and I think the pandemic kind of has shown that anybody can fall below the poverty line. But there are certain groups and certain types of children that are a much higher risk of being in poverty. I think the first stat is a really important one for kind of our work in schools. So at the moment, 3 out of 4 children, 75% of children who are growing up in poverty are in a family where one of their parents works. I think this is just a key point, that work doesn't necessarily at the moment provide a route out of poverty because of the types of jobs that might be available to families. And I think these are kind of more likely to be some of those families that get overlooked because they might not be eligible for some of the support that we kind of talk about, free school meals, Pupil Premium, etc. But they will be struggling to get by, and they will be living below that poverty line. So definitely something to bear in mind. Again, really stark figures. If you're a child from a Black and minority ethnic group, then you're kind of twice as likely than white children to be growing up in poverty, and that number goes up. Again, we're talking about Bangladeshi and Pakistani families in terms of sort of the risk of being of growing up in poverty. Again, sort of 2 other types of families that are at risk of poverty. One is lone parent families, and that's predominantly because it's much harder for a lone parent to earn enough to escape poverty when you just have kind of one income. And finally, larger families. Of course, there are sort of higher costs associated the more children that you have, but there are also certain government policies that at the moment currently disadvantage families even more. So for example, the 2-child limit is a policy that restricts some benefit support to the first 2 children in a household, and subsequent 3rd and subsequent children don't get access to some of that support. So that's sort of one of the reasons why larger families are more at risk. I don't want to kind of go into this too much, but just really to emphasize the point that when we're talking about poverty and the reasons that people end up in poverty, we're talking about structural issues in society and challenges that families might face. So that's everything from, as I sort of touched on, the idea of low paid or insecure work not paying enough to escape poverty, of course, housing costs. The rising cost of living is obviously a particularly huge and significant problem for families this year, and will add to some of the financial hardship families will face. And then this idea of benefits freeze. So there have been sort of multiple cuts and freezes within the benefit system, and this has a huge impact on families if at that time where they need support, the benefit system or that kind of safety net is far too low and doesn't give them enough help to escape poverty. So those are some of the kind of issues that families are facing. Here I just thought it's quite a useful illustration of a girl with a big backpack on, and I think it's just quite a nice, helpful way of thinking about when we're thinking about children coming to school who might be living in poverty. They're coming into the school gates, but actually they're carrying this huge weight of maybe worrying about mum because she's stressed about money, maybe thinking about not being able to afford food at lunchtime, not being able to take part in an after school club like your friends, worrying about different situations. And I think that this is just a kind of helpful way of understanding what children might be facing as they're coming into school and why it might be so much harder for them then to learn when they're in school. So I think that this has kind of been picked up a bit in the chat already, but and I've kind of touched on it, but this idea of kind of how do we measure child poverty in schools? How do we work out who our children, who our disadvantaged children are? And historically, free school meals has been used as that kind of proxy marker to differentiate or to understand which families might be struggling. But I think it's becoming sort of more and more clear as that kind of working, as more and more sort of there's more and more in-work poverty, that actually that is not a good marker for those children, and it's not a good proxy for children that might be struggling. So at the moment, based on some of our most kind of recent analysis, there are 1 million children across the UK who live below that poverty line that I mentioned, but do not qualify for a free school meal each day. So, you know, that threshold at the moment for qualifying for that is incredibly low. It's £7,400 a year household income, and that's before benefits are taken into account. So you can see that actually if you work and earn a bit, it might take you over that threshold, and then you become ineligible for free school meals. And I've just pulled out some quotes here to illustrate this point of a pupil saying that they would much prefer to have that hot lunch, but the mum can't afford it. And another pupil saying not everyone is privileged to pay £2.30 each day. There's people who don't get free school meals who can't pay that. And I think that's a really that just helps to illustrate the point. There are lots of families out there who would benefit from that meal and the support that goes with that, but they just don't qualify. So I think on this point around and taking into account those children that you might not be able to identify because they're not in receipt of free school meals, their families may not have disclosed their situation for various reasons, but just thinking about those families when we're looking at our Pupil Premium funding and understanding how that money can be used effectively to support families who might not be eligible for free school meals. So what kind of whole school approaches or what things can we offer that mean that those families who are struggling but don't qualify can still kind of make the most of the school day and have access to some of that support. Again, I think this has kind of cropped up in the chat around free school meals, the sort of uptake of free school meals. The current or the sort of most recent data suggests that actually there are 11% of pupils who are eligible for free school meals in England, but do not currently take them up, so they do not register. And that has, and so I guess the reason for that, there's lots and lots of different reasons why different families don't register. We know that sometimes families don't know that they're eligible for free school meals. Sometimes there are challenges in terms of filling out that registration form. We know particularly for parents who have English as an additional language that there can be challenges in terms of registering. We also know that some families don't want their pupils or their children, to register because of the sort of stigma and shame that's attached to it. So there is a real challenge here that families and children are kind of missing out on the benefits of free school meals because of the application process for it. But on the flip side, there's also, at the moment, kind of schools are losing out on huge amounts of pupil premium because this 11% aren't currently registered. I think my colleague did some calculations, and we're talking about around £250 million that schools are currently missing because pupils aren't registered. And I think for you as governors, I suppose, while I think that personally, I sort of think there's a problem in the fact that families have to register for this, and we should be looking at some sort of automatic registration system. But in the kind of with the situation that we have as governors, I think there's sort of a conversation to have about how do families register at the moment for free school meals? Are there ways that you can help to increase uptake? I would encourage sort of as much promotion as possible of the entitlement, making sure that there are computers and support available to help families register, those sorts of things. I noticed in the chat someone asked about sort of infant pupils, and this is a real challenge for schools. So at the moment, every infant pupil gets a sort of universal free school meal. So if you're in reception year 1 or 2, you get a free school meal universally. But in order for that pupil premium, for those pupils within the infant years that are kind of eligible pupil premium, they still have to go through the registration process and sign up for means tested free school meals so that schools and government are aware that they're eligible then for pupil premium funding. So there is a real challenge. and schools particularly are missing out on pupil premium funding for those pupils in infant school, because there is less of an incentive for, well, parents sort of see there is less of an incentive to fill out that registration form, because they're already getting that free school meal. So again, I think there's, I've spoken to lots of schools and local authorities who try and do a bit of awareness raising with parents around the pupil premium funding, or try and incentivize parents to fill out that registration form because of the benefits for the whole school. So definitely something to think about there. As I mentioned, the project that I work on is called The Cost of the School Day, and it's been running now for a couple of years. And the aim of the project is to go into and work with schools and talk to children and young people and families about kind of all aspects of the school day. So really unpicking from start to finish where there might be financial barriers or poverty related stigma, and thinking about actually what impact does that have on that pupil in terms of their experience of school. So does it sort of restrict their participation? Does it mean they're not getting the same experience as everybody else? And what impact does that then have on their ability to learn and kind of thrive like other pupils? I think that, again, this illustration is just to show that there are these kind of multiple costs, and this isn't even the half of it. But I think you'll see from the pictures here that some of the things are very obvious, or very significant, and things that we talk about a lot. So, for example, school uniforms or trips. But there are lots and lots of other hidden costs that don't get as much attention. But from our research with pupils and families, they're kind of creating lots of barriers and challenges. So things like being able to attend a disco or a fair, or being able to bring in a birthday cake like your peers when it's your birthday. All of these things contribute to pupils on a low income having a different experience of school, and that in itself is a really hard and sad kind of truth, but it also has a knock-on effect for pupils' outcomes. If you can't go on the school trip or take part in music, then that kind of changes your experience of education. We've recently published a report called The Cost of the School Day in England, Pupils' Perspectives. So I will share a link to that, because that kind of pulls together all of the research that we've done in England so far. And while, as I mentioned, we've looked at all aspects of the school day, these are some of the 4 kind of themes or key themes that have come up within that research in terms of where the biggest costs or most significant costs and barriers are in terms of children accessing a full education. So the first one is just the sort of costs associated with curriculum and learning. So that's everything from children needing stationery, a calculator, a laptop, to actually the costs that are attached to some subjects. So pupils talked really clearly to us about the fact that things like music, art and design, food tech, if you take up those subjects in secondary school, then you end up paying lots of additional costs to take part. And if you can't pay, sometimes your experience is different to others. So in one case, a pupil couldn't take home their graphics project because they hadn't paid. So these are just a lot of things that come through from pupils. And I guess I've picked out one comment there that just says, I would have liked to have done it, I wouldn't have done it if I'd have known the cost. We buy lots of food stuff. I don't think it's fair. It's just a real example of that. Other issues that have come through in that report is, again, sort of school food is obviously a big one. So that's both in terms of those families who are really struggling to pay for food each day, and the sort of cost of food being a barrier, but also those children who are in receipt of free school meals and their experience of receiving it, and how they're sometimes made to feel different or embarrassed or ashamed because of some of the administrative processes that schools have in place. So there's a really kind of sad quote here that sometimes people don't have anything to eat and they have to beg their friends for food. They should give one free meal to people who don't have enough money. So people, they're just reflecting on that situation of some children actually don't have enough money at the moment for a school meal each day. Other areas that came up, obviously sort of school fun, I've touched on this idea of those sort of accumulative costs throughout the year. Some of the things that lots of children most look forward to, like dressing up days, celebrations, discos, etc., that are really exciting and important part of the school year. But actually, for those children on a low income, they can be a really stressful time. And it's a sort of time that sometimes shines attention on their lack of income. So if you can't afford to sort of buy a dressing up outfit, or if you can't afford to go to the disco, then other children notice. And then finally, we talk about kind of broadly like stigma, but in particular in this section, we look at uniform. And we've heard lots from pupils about being kind of sanctioned for not having the right uniform. And again, this is really something that we're trying to challenge, in that, you know, where pupils can't afford uniform and they're then getting detentions or missing out on learning, that's just really detrimental for a number of reasons. So that's a bit of an overview of the report that I'll share, but I just wanted to focus in on school uniform in a bit more detail, because as I alluded to, this is kind of one of the most significant costs for families, and particularly families that have kind of more than one children. It's a huge amount of money that they're often having to fork out. And sometimes the things that we found contribute to this are where there's a long list of kind of compulsory items that families need, where they have to have PE kits as well, where they can only purchase their uniform from one supplier. These are the sorts of things that parents tell us sort of add to that cost and that stress. But really importantly, this year, the Department for Education have brought out statutory uniform guidance for schools. And that places a sort of statutory responsibility on schools to consider their uniform policies and ensure that they're affordable for families. And this kind of guidance actually already exists in Wales. So I suppose I'm encouraging those who are listening today to go away and really look at that guidance and really sort of ask questions about your school uniform policy. So part of the guidance states that schools need to have kind of second-hand or pre-loved uniform provision available. So does your school have this? We've developed, in partnership with Children North East and the Children's Society, we've developed some really useful resources to help schools in developing that pre-loved uniform, because again, you want to make sure that that's non-stigmatizing, that families can access it, that families want to use it. So we've got some sort of helpful resources for schools looking at that. And then again, this question of kind of, have you actually consulted with your school community about uniform costs? What do parents think? Do they think it's affordable? Are they struggling with certain aspects? Just really kind of unpicking it and having a look at it to make sure that it actually works for your school community. Just to sort of, in terms of the way that the project works, I think I sort of alluded to this already. Obviously, we're going into schools and asking children and young people what they think, and we're asking them about some of the barriers, but we're also asking pupils what their school is doing really well, and we're trying to share a lot of that good practice through our resources in terms of what schools doing that are reducing some of those costs. And then we also try and gain ideas and examples and suggestions from pupils as well. So we ask them what they think should be done to make the school day better for them and their peers. And pupils have given us sort of a whole range of suggestions, and I'll just pick out a few in the kind of dark blue here. So one pupil said, just make sure that there's one free activity on offer at all school events. And that's just a way of making sure that whatever the event is, that everybody can take part regardless of income. Another pupil said just making sure that there's an affordable school year, so spacing out events rather than having lots of kind of charity days all clumped together. How can you make sure that parents and pupils have enough time in between events, and also enough kind of notice is given, so that there's not that kind of stress or worry in terms of finding a costume or finding money to pay for something. Another pupil talked about just lending resources without trouble. So this idea that you know, if you come into school and you don't have the right materials, that you aren't embarrassed or ashamed for that, and that the teachers just kind of help you out and give you what you need so you can learn. And then the final one, just around thinking about those home learning tasks. Obviously, this came up a lot in the pandemic, that lots of children do not have the resources and tools that they need at home to be able to take part in learning. And there's obviously sort of big solutions that we need to look at for that. But one pupil just suggested making sure that like tasks and expectations take into account the fact that people might not have ICT or their support in order for them to get access to ICT. So just some ideas from pupils there. So I think I'm kind of coming to the end, but just a few more questions, I suppose, for governors to think about when you go away from this and thinking about the cost of the school day. I think firstly, getting a really good understanding of what does it cost families with pupils at your school for those pupils to fully participate in school life. Do you have a kind of good understanding from across the school day, across the school year, of what families are having to pay to take part? I think kind of carrying out that exercise and looking at all the costs and then thinking about where those costs can be reduced. That's not to say that we're saying that schools should be absorbing those costs. A lot of the things we're talking about are cost neutral or just about doing things in a different way. But where can you reduce some of those costs and just make things easier for those families that might be struggling? The second point is, what support does your school offer to families that are struggling? So if you do have things like subsidies for school trips, if you do have free places for after school clubs, like, do families know about that? Do they know, is it well promoted? Do they know who they can speak to if they might be struggling? Is there somebody they can go to? And then I suppose the second part of that is just, are you also in a position to kind of refer families on who might be struggling to other services and being really aware of what's available in your local area? The third point here is about monitoring. Again, looking at the different things that you offer at your school, sort of monitoring who takes part in them. Is it the same children that are going on the school trips and going to the after school clubs? And are there some children that are constantly missing out on these experiences or opportunities? Monitoring can be a really helpful way of just making sure that there is this sort of equity and of experience within your school. And then finally, but probably most importantly, how does your pupil voice inform policy and practice at your school? This is kind of key to the project. We often go to schools that are doing sort of hundreds of amazing things and have really good intention, but they've often made kind of assumptions about children's experiences of the school day. And actually, when we go in and talk to pupils, we uncover some of the things that they find difficult that the school just hadn't thought about. So really kind of centering some of what you're doing around pupil voice and thinking about the school day from a poverty sensitive lens. Like, can children in poverty take part in everything that your school has to offer? As I kind of flagged, we've got lots and lots of resources to help schools with this process, to help them start thinking about it, what might be able to do differently, lots of examples and good practice from other schools as well. And as I said, that point around the kind of uniform policy, we've developed these resources called the Right Blazer. So I'd really recommend having a look at those and thinking about your school uniform policy. And I will, please do get in touch if you have any questions or if you want to talk more about this, but I will leave it there for now because I think I'm at my time.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was really, really informative. And we have got lots and lots of questions coming in the chat for both yourself and Sam. Now, I think we've got around 15 questions-ish. I don't think we're going to get through them in the last 10 minutes. So what we're going to do is, if anyone has submitted a question directly through the Q&A that we don't get an opportunity to answer live today, we're going to drop those questions to Kate and Sam following the webinar, and we'll get back in touch with people individually with responses to those, because they are fantastic questions and it would be such a shame for us not to be able to get responses to those. Summarising a few of the main questions together, we've had quite a few people asking around Pupil Premium in EYFS and nurseries. Sam, I'm wondering, could you give us a moment of your time to reflect on Pupil Premium within a nursery setting? Is there anything that important that governors should know about? Anything that we should be aware of?
Thanks, Ashley. I'm hoping Kate will build on this, but Pupil Premium, obviously, that I was talking about in terms of what I covered earlier, is targeted very specifically from infants onwards. For early years, there is additional funding, the Early Years Pupil Premium, which is slightly different, but still additional funding for early years settings and eligible for children for 3 and 4 year olds. So it is there. And it's something that can potentially be accessed. I'm not totally sure on the eligibility requirements on it, Kate. I don't know if you are more aware of the eligibility on the early years one.
I don't know, I'm afraid. But yeah, we could have a look into it. I am aware that it's actually unfortunately, it's not a huge amount of money that we're talking about. Like, it's a really small pot of funding. And I know that there are certain challenges for sort of those working in early years settings in terms of I guess almost the like getting access to that is quite difficult, and sometimes it's almost more difficult than the value of the money itself. So yeah, I think it's not adequate is what would be my kind of reflection on it. But I don't know, I assume the eligibility criteria is similar to that in schools.
Thank you, Kate. We've had quite a few questions around the eligibility of Pupil Premium, and we obviously mentioned in the presentation that not every parent who is eligible for free school meals will apply for it. And equally, there are many pupils that could live in deprived areas and in deprived circumstances, but they don't qualify. So we have a question here, which is, can Pupil Premium be used to help those children who don't qualify but are still in need? And I suppose I'll open that up to both of you.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this kind of goes back to the point I was making. I think the Pupil Premium, although it's there and it is targeted, obviously the department still believes that it's the responsibility of leaders and the governing board to decide how they use that. So actually, it's fairly widespread practice to use it in a way that it would benefit not just the pupils that would be technically eligible, but using it in a way that would actually have a positive impact on other students within the school. And I think that's actually how lots of schools can actually maximize that funding in the best way possible. And then I guess the other thing we haven't mentioned, Ashley, is for multi-academy trusts as well, there is potentially the option to pool that funding. It's not particularly common practice, to be honest. I know lots of trusts are still quite keen. That's one area where they don't tend to pool the money together across the trust. They still kind of do it on a school by school basis, but that option is there. So absolutely, there's actually quite a lot of freedom with how you can use the money itself.
That's great. Thank you, Sam. I'm sure that'll be really helpful to the people that have posed that question. I'm afraid we are getting towards time now, so we won't have an opportunity to answer any more questions live on air, but we will be passing these over after the webinar and hope to get back to people fairly shortly with responses. If the topic of today's webinar has been of interest, what I would like to very briefly do is mention the next term of the Governors for Schools annual campaign. The campaign this year is called All Pupils, Every Ambition, and next term we're going to be taking forward these crucial themes in a little bit more detail. The focus of the term is called Empowered Education, and we're going to be looking at child poverty. We'll be looking at cultural capital, student enrichment, character development, and learning outside of the classroom. We believe that education is about more than academic attainment alone. There are so many other areas of school life that students should have the opportunity to access. And as governors, we're in a unique position to be able to support from a strategic perspective. So the third term of the campaign is going to focus very much more on these areas. Governors have an opportunity to take part in free webinars, look at blogs and articles that will be written by guest collaborators. And crucially, we'll be looking at what governors can do to address these challenges that schools face. More information is going to be coming out via email and on our social media channels in the coming weeks, so please do have a look for those. Now, the content of today's webinar, you're warmly welcome to share with your colleagues on school boards and in schools, so please feel free to pass the slides and the presentation that you'll get via email after this webinar to those people. We hope to see you at a webinar in the future. Over the next 2 weeks, we have got webinars around attendance and one around supporting students with special educational needs and disabilities in accessing careers education, and you're warmly invited to attend those events. I'd like to thank you so much for attending today, and special thanks go to Kate and Sam for their time, the preparation that they've given to the webinar, and the really interesting and valuable content that you've shared with our listeners today. Thank you very much to both of you.
Thanks so much, Ashley.
Hope everyone has a lovely afternoon. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you at a webinar in the future. Take care.